Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris Dows. I'm an Associate Professor of Creative Writing at the University of Lincoln. I'm also a professional writer. I've been for over 30 years. I'm mostly specialised in licensed products, and for the best part of 10 years, I was a writer for Black Library Press for Warhammer. So I'm going to be coming at this discussion from a slightly different topic, from a creator, a real life Warhammer writer. And I want to consider quite an old narrative theory concept of intertextuality, which I'll cover very briefly in a few seconds, and its importance in writing for a licensed product. Obviously Warhammer primarily. I'm not going to talk about Star Trek because everybody will probably burst into flames. So the whole idea is it's going to be focused on Warhammer, and does it actually impede creativity as a writer? And that's my area, one of my many areas of interest and of research. So start with a few quotes here. The bastard form of mass culture is humiliated repetition. Always new books, new programs, new films, new items, but always the same meaning. That was Roland Barthes. All meaning is intertextual. No text is complete or autonomous in itself. It needs to be read, and it is read, in relation to other texts, which is J. Lemke. What I cannot crush with words, I will crush with the tanks of the Imperial Guard. That was Lord Commander Solar Macarius, so that's what he had to say about words. So the whole idea of intertextuality is something that's been around for some time. Aristotle, Genet, many other theorists have talked about writing coming with limitations. Now, as an educator, because I've been teaching creative writing as long as I've been a professional writer, my opinion is that you cannot be an effective writer unless there are boundaries, whether it's genre, format, textual size, the structure, the audience, whatever. There's a lot of literary theory that examines these boundaries, but they generally apply to create our own text, the unique text. There's very little analysis when it comes to what the potential restrictions are or what the advantages might be of writing within popular franchises. So this is why I wanted to take this opportunity to start exploring this very briefly. I'm only going to be touching, like scraping the surface of it. But I think it's very important, and hopefully I can give you some kind of insight into what the creative process is when you're involved actually writing the lore, obviously working off the same codexes of everybody else. So the whole idea of the reliance on what's come before, it was discussed earlier on in the first round of discussions, particularly about IP. When you're working for Warhammer, the IP is, as you all be well aware, jealously guarded, and it's controlled, and it's obviously crucial when you've got such a knowledgeable and, dare I say, critical audience. There's a very high basis of shared knowledge. Now, from a creative perspective, this can lead to some very detailed and, I'll be honest with you, at times frustrating editorial meetings and feedback, because if you get the IP wrong, you will be told as a creative, whether it's the idea, the story in the first place, or getting down to the details of, I don't know, the inside of a shadow sword or something like that. So you've absolutely got to get it right. When you pitched, when you've been commissioned by Black Library, or whether you've pitched or not, you need to have done your homework, and all that's available is the same things that's available to everybody else. So you've always got to have at least the same level of understanding of the IP as the audience. Additionally, you may also be privy as a creative to the moves or the changes that are coming, particularly in some of the figure lines. That was a very heavy influence for me, particularly with Elysian Troops, which I'll come back to in a short while. It's not easy to work on a licensed product. It takes research, it takes all the usual skills of a writer, plus knowing what the IP is. But that research can make the difference between success and failure when you're working with a license. So, intertextuality, very briefly, if you're not used to this concept. Late 60s, literary critic Julia Kristeva, she posed the idea that all texts are based on what's come before. It was like one of these semiotic things where, yeah, well, that's obvious, but she gave it a name and everybody kind of agreed that, oh, yeah, that's an interesting concept. Okay. Warhammer has this heterogeneous relationship with what has come before, and from a wider narrative and character arc, what may come in the future. That has got a huge impact on an author, and it also shaped a lot of the stuff that I wrote. Knowing your area of the segmentum, because by and large, as a Warhammer author, you're given a tiny part of the segmentum to write. You couldn't do it all, it would drive you insane. So you're given a small part, you try to become an expert in that part. If it's not controlled like that, well, continuity would go out the window, and chaos would indeed reign. But does this regulation mean that the creative process is impeded? More. And that's kind of what I want to take a look at. Now, I mostly concentrated on boots on the ground. I did some Space Marine stuff, worked with White Scars, Angels Eradicant, Death Watch, and the last thing I actually ever did was a Blackstone Fortress audio drama. But the biggest success I got was with Elysians and Cadians. And it's interesting that they both have firmly established IPs, but the detail of those IPs was perhaps the key to creative freedom. So let me take a look at the first case study, which I haven't quite mentioned yet. Khârn the Betrayer. This was by far the most challenging and restrictive work that I produced from a number of reasons. The codex restrictions on this and the narrative control were quite mighty. I had this brief, which was, it had to be done as 8 serialized short stories that would then be collected as a novel. Now, I'd worked in comic books for 15 years, so I was used to that kind of structure of doing small parts that went together to form a bigger story arc, or would come out as a trade paperback or something like that. So I was approached to do it from a kind of structural familiarity. But what it did was it immediately shaped the storytelling. So every single episode had to have a certain rising action, but not as big as the finale, which was the 8th part. So therefore, when it all went together, it would create some kind of cogent story structure. Now, the problem with Khârn Berserkers and with Khârn in particular, Khârn the Betrayer, was that there'd already been quite a lot written about it. So then it was down to me, well, how much room have I actually got to do anything new with it? And I think of all the work that I produced, that novel probably got the most negative press, because a lot of the readers didn't really like what I did with Khârn. I didn't really do anything new, but that was because I wasn't really allowed to. I had to stick, particularly because they had this very, very long, it was all at the 13th Black Crusade, all that kind of thing. I had to stick, I had a start point and an end point, pretty much kind of do what I wanted in the middle, but I was very, very restricted about what I could actually do with the story. And it's interesting, one of Kristeva's actual quotes is that any text is constructed as a mosaic of quotations. Any text is the absorption and transformation of another. Well, I pretty much had to stick with the quotations. There was quite a lot of control of the text. Was it frustrating? In a way, but then I knew that it was Khârn the Betrayer. It was a major character at the time, and I was very happy to be given it. Like I just mentioned, from a plot perspective, I was got a beginning, got an end. So that was it. It had to finish with a huge fight with Abaddon the Despoiler, which obviously I was looking forward to very, very much, and hopefully that the readers did too. I had a bit of latitude with, because obviously I had to get Space Marines in there somewhere, so I worked with the White Scars, which I'd done some short stories on before, and particularly the Angels Eradicant, which I deliberately chose because there wasn't a lot in the IP, and I absolutely loved the white armor. So I just thought, right, okay, well, I'm going to go for them. And interestingly, this finding gaps in the IP, this finding not greatly represented parts of the Warhammer universe, the 40k universe, that turned out to be the key to what I then better developed, and I had much more creative freedom. So yeah, Blood for the Blood God was quite a bloody thing to write, and I'd say it was probably the least successful thing that I did, but it set me up in a pattern for, I think, better experiences as a creative. So let me bring you on to Elysian Troops, who I absolutely adore. Now, I started with a character in, how long ago was it? 2011. That's right, because I was talking with Nick Khârn, who, funnily enough, is an ex-student of mine. He was the senior editor at the time. And I was commissioned to write a short story because at the time there was a plan to expand the Elysian Troop figures, which I was really, really pleased about. Now, you'll know about the vertical integration in Games Workshop. You know, you order the figures to say, thank you for your order. Have you considered reading this? You buy the books, they say, thank you for your order. Have you considered buying these figures? It's all terribly sophisticated and works really, really well. But as you'll also be aware, not all Warhammer players read Black Library. Even so, the sales are strong enough to continue with just the publications. So, had the discussion. There was considerable potential with the two main characters that I proposed. One was a veteran sergeant, Zachariah, and a demolition specialist, Adjulant. And the editorial then drove their further development. Very little to go on in terms of IP. There was a handful of images, most of which are on these slides. A mention of pirates and orcs around Elysia, but that was pretty much it. So I thought, okay, I've got a bit of freedom here, but I can't really do a lot in short stories. They're only 4,000 or 5,000 words. So I started to actually put in clues if Zachariah was further developed. And this was quite a long running conversation with the editorial at the time, because I wanted to return or go to Elysia at some point. That then changed direction. We were originally going to do a novel. After the Khârn novel came out, again, because there was still messing around with the expansion of the Elysian Troop line, we batted ideas backwards and forwards, and it then pretty much turned into a 3-part audio drama, because they were going from audio books, just audio versions of existing materials, to audio dramas, and I was very much involved and interested in sound. So again, because being from a script background, I basically got this commission. So the novel turned into a 3-part audio drama, never been done before, and I don't actually think it was ever done afterwards. So that turned into Signs of Elysia, Renegades of Elysia, Martyrs of Elysia. And because there was so little codex information, I really went to town on it. I started to develop the Elysians and Elysia as much as I felt I could get away with. Obviously, there was a lot of conversation went on with the editorial, but there was a lot of restrictions. I could pretty much go where I went. I could pretty much do with what I wanted with the characters that I'd already developed, which is definitely an advantage of intertextuality once you start to carve out your own area in the segmentum or within a license. I wanted to do a character-based story and expand the codexes, and I was basically allowed to do that. And this is what I actually managed to add to the canon. So the Elysian geography and locations across the planet, the Elysian drop troop training techniques, which formed a good part of 2 of the audio dramas, broader development of this whole Elysian pirate thing, including the invention of the planet Vale and Sinestri as the headquarters of the pirate faction, the politics of Elysian houses, which I also threw in a bit of Sicilian in there, I chucked a bit of vendetta in there just for shits and giggles. And then further character development of veteran Adjulant and Sergeant Zachariah, building on earlier traits, e.g. it was hinted in the short stories he did not want to go back to Elysia. And that all plays out in the 3-part drama. So that was a lot to add. And sure enough, it's all been dropped into the Warhammer wikis and so on and so forth. And there's even fan stories based around some of the things that I was able to add. So the big problem, however, was that you've got players that don't really read, and then you've got readers who don't really like audio dramas. So that was a little bit of a disadvantage. The format turned out to be a hindrance, I think, to its popularity. I still stand by it as an audio drama. I think it works really, really well. It can be difficult to do cross-platform because I did a lot of comic book versions of licensed products, Star Trek Next Generation, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and so forth. But it's still sold over 50,000 units, so someone's listening to it. Third case study is, for me, the most successful thing that I ever did for Warhammer. Titan's Bane, a standalone audio drama set in a shadow sword. Now, there was a lot written about heavy armor and a lot written about the Cadians. What I wanted to do was use the fall of Cadia as thematic plot development and character motivation. So I was being quite focused on this, but it was a surprisingly free process. And of course, I got to mess around with tanks, which is always a good thing. So I was finishing Martyrs of Elysia in mid-2017, and I met with Nick again, and he said he wanted to do a real-time tank story. Like, oh, okay then. We batted the ideas about the basic premise, but it was basically up to me to develop. Now, there's loads of IP about heavy armor, like I just said. Plenty of books written on it as well. I read them all, but I wanted it to be character-driven, and it was most certainly nowhere near as restrictive as the Red Path, the Khârn story. In fact, it actually turned out to be an advantage. So from a plot perspective, how tension could be created between the crew as well as events outside, that led to me selecting a Shadow Sword Titan, perfect number of characters for a standalone sub-hour drama, 6, and also the idea of using the tank itself. I wanted to give the machine spirit a voice. I wanted to make it a character. And that hadn't been done very often before either. It had been done in the books, but not in audio. So that was an example of actually the format not being a hindrance, but driving creative decisions and hopefully enhancing the potential effectiveness of the narrative. So we've got the Fall of Cadia. That pretty much was in the back of my mind when I was talking to Nick. There were plenty of other identified races who had mechanized divisions: Mordians, Death Court of Krieg, Talans, Paragonians. So that intertextuality gave me a selection because I wanted this tension inside the tank as well as outside the tank with what was going on with the Nurgle hordes trying to dissolve it and drill into it and so on and so forth. Because of the Fall of Cadia, then I thought, right, well, I'll keep them as the primary kind of owners of the tank. 13th Black Crusade had just gone, and it occurred to me that when it fell, survivor's guilt would be massive in any Cadian that wasn't there to attempt to protect their homeworld. So that really fed the whole story, the fact that they went to a very, very badly judged attack or the landing on this Zalzat on this homeworld in the first place. It was all pretty much badly thought out and doomed because they were in such a hurry to cleanse their guilt. And I thought that was very, very powerful as a motivation. Also, because you had then a mixed crew, because this conflict inside had to come from somewhere, I started carefully choosing who from the other worlds I could put in the tank to create this this conflict. The Mordian comms officer, that's fair enough. They're very, very proper, very, very precise and prim. But a Paragonian gunner, because Paragonians revere the cult Mechanicus, And I decided to make the Khârn driver, who survived from a previous story, which was never unfortunately recorded. It was written but never recorded. He's an atheist. So you've got these fights between the driver and the gunner, and that's how a lot of the tension rises inside the tank. And meanwhile, Quilla, she's trying to keep a lid on it all, literally keep a lid on it all. Then there's the machine spirit, who's so affected by the negative vibes coming from the Khârn crew and the fighting in the tank. The whole trauma of Khârn affects the machine spirit. And you've got the volcano cannon way over its safe operating range. I mean, I was just chucking everything in there from the IP that I could to really screw their day up. And it just built and built and built. So about 46 minutes. I don't know whether you've heard it or not. I'd recommend you do, because I think it works really well. It's not just because I wrote it. There we are. So this is with the whole setting the whole stage, exterior-interior conflict. I think Titan's Bane is a perfect example of how intertextuality can positively influence the creative process and support rather than hinder the narrative invention. I could concentrate on developing character-based conflict within the IP and use external sounds, even music, diegetic, non-diegetic sound to really, really build it. The voice actors did a fantastic job. It was so many layers where I felt that the IP was working together. So that was, I think, the most effective result of working within intertextuality. Just very briefly, intertextual advantage versus inventive and author disadvantage. So first of all, you've got an existing gameplayers create a ready-made readers or listeners. That is the best thing about writing a license. You've got an audience. Disadvantage, audience subject knowledge, potentially higher than the author, may not engage with non-print format in the case of games or audio drama. So you've got the whole format thing that I talked about earlier on. And they might not like what you do with the characters, but let's not even go there. Existing characters and locations within the IP presents a blueprint for story development and world building. Yeah, great, it's pretty much all done. Then again, restrictive character and location development of unique narratives can be challenging. Popular new characters, of course, anything you come up with, well, Games Workshop PLC own them. Mind, it hasn't bothered Dan Abnett, but there you go. Existing continuity allows for narratives set across a broad timeline. Yes, we know that they like to mess with the timeline. Difficulty in locating self-contained storylines if beginning and end points for the project are set. That was Khârn the Betrayer. And development of unique narratives can be challenging, as I've kind of intimated. Finally, the longevity of the published work can be extensive. Most of my stuff is still available even after a few years, but then again, Black Library will happily remove stuff that doesn't sell anymore, and with it, your identity as a Warhammer writer. It's not happened to me yet, thank goodness. So, to summarise, writing for Warhammer, fantastically rewarding, absolutely loved it when I was doing it. Heavily influenced by intertextuality in the form of the IP, which can, under certain creative and commercial circumstances, create barriers to narrative invention, but under some other circumstances, it can allow very, very much character-driven stories to be developed, which I think is at the heart of Black Library's success. The hardware, lore, and universe might be cool, but all Warhammer readers share a universal truth with all audiences. If they don't care about the characters, about what happens to them in story, no amount of space battle descriptions will keep them reading or the writer writing, particularly that. And I'd like to end on a Susan Sontag quote of all things. If literature has engaged me as a project, first as a reader, then as a writer, it is an extension of my sympathies to other selves, other domains, other dreams, other worlds, and other territories.